Today is Rita Hauser, Dr. Hauser. Let me acknowledge as we just begin that her husband is also here, Gus Hauser. Welcome both of you to Duke Law School.
Thank you.
As Dr. Hauser has had a long and interesting and varied career in the law, in international law, in philanthropy, in politics, and we're going to welcome your questions in about a half an hour or so. But why don't we start by just at the beginning, just a little bit at the beginning. You got your AB at Hunter, and then did you immediately then go off and study abroad?
Well, let me step back a little bit and thank you all for coming. It's very nice to see so many of you all. And enjoy your lunch. And I'm going to leave with the message in simple words to you. Mix it up. Do a lot. Do all kinds of things. Don't just walk down a narrow path. So I hope I'm going to concentrate, David, on why you should do lots of different things in life and make you a better lawyer and a better citizen. I was always very good in languages, and I was a gifted student, so I was ahead in my years at school. And my interest in languages led me to be interested in other countries, and I particularly concentrated in the Romance languages and French. But along the way, when I was at Hunter College, I had the great good luck of meeting Eleanor Roosevelt, who was then, as you know, one of the founders of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she was putting her papers together, and long story short, she invited me to help her with it one summer at Hyde Park. So that's how I got interested in the Universal Declaration and how she got into it and her life and so on.
Now that opportunity might not still be available.
Well, no, there'll be somebody other than Eleanor Roosevelt.
Absolutely.
There'll be some other figure, and there's always something that happens if you take advantage of it. That's the key. So I got very interested in international law, the UN, and I was very active in college in the UN student movement. And so I was deeply interested in international organizations. So that's sort of how it all kind of, how it began. But I had a professor of French history who was a great expert on the French Revolution. And she wanted me to be a professor, and I wanted to be a lawyer. And there was a lot of tug and pull, and she also changed my life because she said to me, you know, you always have time for law school. Why don't you apply for a Fulbright and go and study in France? So I applied for Fulbright, which I won, and I went to France. And there I asked for Strasbourg, which was then the center of the European community, which it is now. The Parliament of Europe is in Strasbourg. And I got very interested in the European community, and I wrote my doctoral thesis at Strasbourg, the origins of the common market and where it was going and where I thought it would wind up. And I think way back then, you'll find this very interesting. I was already writing journal things. I wrote a long article which appeared in the Journal of Comparative Law before I was a lawyer on the history of money and nominalism and money in law. And I got a letter out of the blue from Milton Friedman, who liked my article. He was very interested in what I had to say about the nominal value of money. We became pen pals. And I predicted when I finished my doctorate, way back then, I wrote an article and I said, Europe will one day have a single currency. It seemed to me the inevitable in the political process if you understood where Europe was going. And I have a letter which I still have in my file in which Milton said, my dear, have you lost your mind? And there was a long debate among many people that Europe could Germany give up the Deutsche Mark? I mean, and Britain, of course, still hasn't given up the pound, but it will. And that was, I saw how things were unfolding, and so I'd already been accepted at Harvard Law School. I'm going to tell you a little story, because his father was one of my great mentors. He was then, of course, the head of the University of Chicago and a fantastic person, and I'd been accepted at Chicago Law School as well. And I went to see him and I said, what should I do, Harvard or Chicago? And to my great surprise, he said, for you, because there are so few women really in the law and you're going to have a great career, go to Harvard. It will do more for you than coming to my school, but we'll remain good friends. And we remain very good friends, your father and I. So I went to Harvard Law School when I finished my work in France, and I was already in my head, I knew I'm going to work in the international field. Now, I have to tell you, this is not prehistoric times, it's not that long ago, but we were only 11 women in my class at the law school out of 440-something. I was the only woman in my section of 125 by some fluke, so it was still a period when there were not that many women in the law.
It's still that way.
No, now it's...
No, at Harvard, I meant.
50% of the class are women now.
Stop
But the one good thing, my good husband who was sitting here had graduated from Harvard Law School. He was in military service, came out and thought he might like to teach. He was at Harvard Law School, a lowly instructor, and we started dating within 2 weeks after I got there. And that was the first
You were
Harvard...
not his student, however.
No, I wasn't. And that was the first faculty-student marriage at Harvard. I suppose today it would be sexual harassment.
No,
I don't know what they
no.
call it today. But we both decided after we got married that really was my influence. I said, you know, let's stay in this international business because this is where the world is going. Everything is going to be moving. America is going to take a great role in the world, and I knew that I wanted to practice in that field. Now, it was very difficult for women getting out of law school. For example, Ruth Ginsburg, who's a good friend of mine, she was a year ahead of me, and she couldn't get a job. And she finally wound up teaching at Rutgers Law School because no one would hire her. She already had a baby. Sandra Day O'Connor went into politics. Sandra used to tell me all the time because she couldn't get a job in a law firm. I mean, it's hard for young women today to appreciate that, but nobody was hiring women, or if they did, like I made the rounds with all the big law firms, they all said, well, estates and trusts, that's where women were sent to. I said, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in international law. I was totally fluent in French. I had a French law degree by that time. And, you know, you got, well, you can't travel alone, and what will you do in a hotel abroad, and all this kind of baloney. I just persevered. I wanted to do that, and I said that's what I was going to do. So fortunately, I don't have to give you my whole career, but I made my way into international law.
In a firm.
In a law firm after I'd served in the Justice Department for a time. And what I did was very interesting. I built a big clientele. I had a very large international clientele. I had clients largely from Europe and the Middle East. And, you know, we were very conversant. French was my language, and we were using French codes. And I got a lot of Latin American clients with the same French code system. And I spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I had clients in almost all the countries of the Middle East. And that's how I built my practice. And I'll give you a word for anybody, male or female. If you can bring a lot of clients and a lot of business to a law firm, you will flourish. So that was how I did it. Other women had to do it differently, but that was my way. And then I was always interested in politics, so I kept a good hand in it. And my father had been involved in politics, and it was New York Republican politics, so the Nelson Rockefeller kind of Republican politics. And I was introduced early on to the Attorney General, was Herbert Brownell. And when Nixon ran the first time, I was asked if I would like to help write speeches for him, which I did. So and frequently in my law work, I took a leave of absence from my firm to do public service.
And so were the speeches on international law?
Yes, it was on international stuff, and so I got to know him very well. He lost that election to Kennedy, as you remember, in a hair. But then he ran for governor 2 years later in California and lost again, his famous bitter speech. But he came to New York to practice, and I sponsored him for the bar. And he and Nelson Rockefeller had a terrible rivalry which existed all the way through to the end. And we became, pretty good friends. And then in 1968, he decided to run again. So I became one of the co-chairs of his campaign. And it was really all the terrible things that happened to Nixon, which I still don't fully comprehend. On foreign policy, he was really a brilliant president. And early on, even in the campaign, he used to say to the small group, I am going to open the door to China. Bringing China back into the world is the key to the world as we will know it. He never lost sight of that. Henry Kissinger was his agent, but it was Nixon's idea that you had to bring China into the world again that would make for the global transformation. And while history will always be rewritten about him, and we can't ever forget the Watergate side, I think he will get far more credit for what he did with the China opening than almost anybody else. So that was a big learning experience, you know, foreign policy on a high level. And when he was elected president, he said to me, you know, come to the White House, I want you to be with me. But I then had my husband, who had a very brilliant career in the making. I had 2 children. And I said, you know, I'm not Superwoman. I'm not going to be able to do all this, you know, in Washington, and kids and family. So that's when I said, why don't I go to the UN? I'm interested in the UN. I'm interested in human rights and international law. So for 4 years, I served in that capacity as the American representative on the Human Rights Commission and to the International Law Committee and the Law Commission.
Now,
So,
I want to ask you about that, but before I do, I think everybody in the room probably knows that Richard Nixon was a Duke Law graduate, but it certainly bears repeating. And I went on the internet and I found something that I think stems probably from the tapes. I'm not exactly sure, but it indicates, from the Nixon tapes, it indicates that you were on the president's wish list for the Supreme Court, and
then I shot myself in the foot.
You did. Well, why not? And why don't you? This here is the quote. The quote from Nixon is, "There goes a Supreme Court justice."
Well,
this is what he said to his policy chief, John Ehrlichman, and then he said, "I can't go that far." That's the year 2000. So what was he talking about?
Well, I was on an ABA panel, and we were talking about women's rights, the Equal Rights Amendment, which was then hanging around. And I forget the exact context, but I said that in my opinion, I thought that there would be, we didn't call it gay marriage then, but there would be homosexual marriage, that was inevitable in the pursuit of all of these rights. So, I mean, that was a shocker beyond shock. That's why he said he couldn't go that far. And as I said, I shot myself in the foot if I was ever really seriously being considered. But I had always capacity to live up to Voltaire's adage that one way of being wrong is being right too soon. So inevitably, this has come to pass. But you know, I have to tell you also as students, never regret and don't look back. You do what you do it with hopefully the best of intent, and you put your mind and your thoughts to it. When you make a decision, go on with it with all your heart and passion and do it well. That's the best way to get on in life.
So the UN, let's get back to that, because that's been very important to you.
Well, I served on the Human Rights Commission, and this was now after Nixon was elected in 1969, and the UN was, in effect, poisoned by 2 big issues. There was apartheid in South Africa and the results of the Six-Day War. When I say poison, every debate, no matter what you were discussing, came around to apartheid and the Israel-Palestine, or then Israel-Arab conflict. You couldn't escape it. And of course, I served as the American representative, so we had to defend Israel in all of the capacities. And we had endless debates about apartheid, where at least the American government was more on the right side. And there too, I really got a great knowledge. I had the occasion to meet Golda Meir, and she saw that I didn't know much about, the history of this conflict, and I didn't know much about Zionism and all of that. She sent me books. She educated me. I traveled a great deal in the Middle East during those 4 years. I think I visited every refugee camp there was, and then some. And I got deeply involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict, and over the years have tried very hard, including the great overture with Arafat, to bring the Palestinians and the Israelis together. And alas, this is now 30 years and we're still working on this conflict. And I hope it will be over before I die, but I can't say that for certain. I think it's one of these intractable conflicts that never really get solved because the stars don't align. If you have the right leader in Israel, you have the wrong leader in Palestine, or vice versa, and you don't have the one chance, which I worked on very hard. I'll tell you the story. The Swedish foreign minister, who was a labor person, had gone to the area after the first Intifada, and he was so upset with what he saw that he was determined to try to bring the PLO and Israel together, because at that point there was no contact between them, and in fact it was illegal in Israel for any Israeli to have any contact with anybody in the PLO. So I started in my own way in my law office. We used to have seminars. There was one exception in the Israeli law if it was educational or at a university. So we made these little seminars in my office, and we brought over Hannah, Shrawi, and all the people that you know, and we brought Israelis, and it was the first contacts between them that they saw that they were real people, they had things in common, and that's how it began. And then the Swedish foreign minister said to me, look, he said, nothing's going to happen unless the United States recognizes the PLO, which was an absolute no-no here, and I would like you to help me in this effort. And if you would do so, I will go to see Secretary Schultz and get his permission. And we've got to do this in secret, but we're going to wind up having a meeting with Arafat, and between you and me, we're going to wind up getting Arafat to accept the conditions of no more terrorism, recognition of Israel, and so on, which is what we did. Took a whole year of many secret meetings, and we wound up in Stockholm, in which finally we got Arafat to get up. He said, no terrorism. It sounded like no tennis. His English was so bad, but we got him to say, no terrorism, recognized Israel, and the United States then recognized the PLO. And when we recognized the PLO, the Israelis recognized the PLO. That ultimately led to Oslo, where I also did a lot of backroom work. And it was a very, very hopeful period. I was really at the peak of hope, because everybody pretty much knows the contours of the settlement, what it will look like. And then again, a fortuitous act when Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated, that deprived Israel of the leader that could bring the Israelis to where they have to be. And in my opinion, they haven't had the right leader since. But that was all part of being involved, and it was. I took a lot of heat about that from a lot of people who thought it was outrageous that I would have anything to do with the PLO. But I felt, how would you ever get any kind of a solution here if the people that represented the Palestinians were not in any measure or form engaged with the Israelis? And so that's where we are now, and I'll predict that not too long from now the Israelis will engage with Hamas. That'll be the next step. And the Palestinians will have to come together between the PLO or PLA and Hamas. But it's a long struggle, and I got to know pretty much everybody in the Middle East through that, all the leaders, and there were many, many people who served with me in the UN who went on to become foreign ministers and of their countries, like the head of the Arab League was my colleague on the UN, and we all have remained friends, and we work together in this whole business. I had a very interesting practice as well of representing a lot of wealthy people who were fleeing their countries, who came, to the United States in the wake of upheaval, turmoil, and so on. So that's how I got to represent a lot of wealthy Iranians just before the Iranian Revolution. And one of my clients it was the Shah. I actually was his lawyer in New York and took his will as he was dying. And so I got to know all of these people, and it's a network that spreads, and I am particularly interested in the Middle East because it's the crucible of Western civilization and Western religions. You kind of get hooked on it. And I had a great ambition, David, which I've never fulfilled. I was a good Bible student, and I was going to hike from Basra in Iraq, which is the biblical Ur, where supposedly Abraham was born. And I was going to hike from there all through the biblical story and get to the promised land. But every time I was trying to do it, there was a war someplace. So I did pieces of it, but someday maybe, before I'm too old, if there's peace, I would like to really do that.
Oh,
And,
well,
because it's
maybe
a
I'll
great
go with
ambition
you.
of mine.
So let's just stay with this one topic a little bit. You've been active in Republican Party politics, but in this last election, you were very active on behalf of President Obama, and you might even have his ear to some extent. What would you advise him on the Middle East if you know, that you would be able to say in this forum?
Well, right now, I wish I could be more optimistic, but I'm not, for the reasons I said earlier. I don't think you have, by far, you don't have the requisite government in Israel that is willing to make the kind of compromises. The Palestinians are divided in two, so you don't have an effective Palestinian partner. I talked to Obama a couple of times in the campaign. He is very interested in doing this, and that's why he named George Mitchell. And I saw George recently at the UN. It's not going very well, and I don't know how much time Obama will devote to it, because he has far bigger things on his plate right now, like getting out of Iraq with some decency and the Afghan war. So I think he will keep working at it, but how much he will work at it, I'm not 100% certain. It's a long story now, and I don't know how it'll finalize. Iran, of course, is another big issue. That's probably the overriding issue for the moment, and I think he has a great opportunity in Iran to open up with the Iranians and begin to bring them into the world, the same way that Nixon brought China back into the world. And that is his hope, but a lot of it will turn on what happens with these nuclear negotiations, and there's obviously internal conflict in Iran, as we know. So that will be interesting to see. I got very involved in human rights when I was at the Human Rights Commission, became an abiding interest of mine, and I supported all sorts of human rights organizations and worked very hard to see that human rights was taught at law schools. And now, of course, it is part and parcel of the curriculum, obviously at the law school here and other law schools, all the conventions, the treaties, all the work in human rights law and humanitarian law, the law of war, which is now, again, a very big subject. I've taught the Geneva Conventions to the Naval Academy, to the Army College. It's a subject of very great interest, and I hope all of you will have an interest in it and go and work for some NGOs. The world has changed over the last decades, the rise of all of these NGOs who have a very great role to play in the way the world is unfolding and how they handle conflict, the things that they do in every aspect of international affairs. I know many people making careers now at NGOs. So, and certainly it's something of great interest around the world. You know, when the Soviet regime collapsed and Yeltsin came in, for a period of about 3 or 4 years, nothing really functioned in Russia. Everything collapsed. If it were not for the NGOs that formed and were helped by outsiders, there wouldn't have been basic delivery of services. And of course, it was a good period in the sense of free press that opened, and so which is now closing down again. But the NGOs played an enormous important role. So I see at all the schools that I'm involved in, like the Kennedy School or Harvard, or I'm sure here, lots of students coming from abroad who are interested in learning more about NGOs, human rights, what work they can do in the field.
Which of the private organizations have been most important to you, that you've had most connection with?
For human rights?
For human rights or in international arena in general?
Well, I think very, very highly of Human Rights Watch. I know that organization very well, and I know Ken Roth, who leads it. I mean, has a very authoritarian view when they pronounce. Most people, most leaders of the world accept that they're pretty accurate and they're pretty fair. So I have supported them a great deal. I chair an organization which is, I've been chair for almost 10 years now, which is 50 years old next year, affiliated with the United Nations, which is called the International Peace Institute, and its role is in peacekeeping. And we We help create peacekeeping units. We advise the Secretary General on the efficacy of the operations. We work hard on putting the peacekeeping apparatus together for all of the different places. There are over 100 peacekeeping operations going on now globally, great number of them in Africa. And so that's something that I'm also very much interested in. And in all of those peacekeeping operations, there's a big human rights component to protect the populations that are caught up in terrible conflict. So that's been another great passion of mine.
We haven't talked about your other passion, which is for music.
Well, that's a sideline. We love music. My husband and I are great music people, you know, played in our days. And so I was on the board of the New York Philharmonic for many years, and on the board of Lincoln Center, and on the board of the Curtis Institute. And even there, you know, talking globally, I have seen how orchestras, for example, if you ever go or see orchestras, over the years, how they have changed. Most orchestras, great orchestras, are now 50% other, I'm talking about American orchestras, 50% foreign. It's an international business. American graduates are going to play in the Korean National Orchestra. Everybody is moving in everybody else's domain. And of course, all the great virtuosi people who are coming from all over. China's producing them in the thousands. This is another illustration of how global the world has become. And I remember the first time that I spoke to the people I was in Vienna on a UN mission. I spoke to the Vienna Orchestra. Somebody asked me to talk to them. There wasn't a single woman in the orchestra. There never had been. And it took a revolution to get one because it was sort of passing father to son. And I remember saying to them, you know, you got to change here. You're going to have women. And also you're going to have Koreans and Chinese and Japanese and this one's and that one's. And, you know, their view was, this is Germanic. We don't have anybody else. Well, you go and see the Vienna Orchestra today and you'll see how different it is. And now about 20 women players and all kinds of international players. So that, too, is an illustration of how the world has changed. And what I say to law students is, whatever you wind up doing, if you're going to work in private practice, if you're going to work in government, whether you work in business, whatever you're going to do, everything today is global. And while you're at law school, you ought to get as much learning as you can about other legal systems, this legal system, other legal systems, the international structure that has come in these last 40, 50 years, treaties, conventions, international courts. This is the world in which you are going to be working and living and practicing. And even if I see quite a few foreigners here, I assume you go back to your home countries, whatever you do, you're going to be, all of you, in the international game. And the sooner that you realize that, the better off that you will be. And if I can put in a pitch, try to learn some languages. I say that to the Americans because the Americans never speak any other languages. Learn some of it, even if you don't wind up speaking it fluently. You understand another culture through its language. And you should put in some effort to try to do that. Live abroad. Take a year off when you finish law school. Go do something with an NGO. See how the world really works, you know, before you settle into what's going to become your big full-time career.
Well, that's great advice. Well, let's see if there's some questions in the room.
Yep.
There.
Why don't you say who you are or where you're from so I get some idea?
Okay, my name is Sean Lavoie. I moved around, but I spent a lot of the last year in the Middle East.
Middle East.
And so I thought the comparison you made between Nixon's wanting to open up to China and Obama's wanting to open up to Iran really interesting. Something I actually hadn't heard before. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about, I guess we read a lot in the news about Iranian political obstacles to that process. But could you tell us anything about American political obstacles to any opening to Iran, similar that Nixon might have faced with China?
Well, Nixon faced plenty of opposition, you know, about opening up China. The China lobby, which was very powerful at the time, accused him of all kinds of treachery and so on. But he persevered. He had that sense. He sold it that they would help us with the Vietnam War, which they never did. That really was not his underlying purpose. And I think, as I said, if Obama can, over the next period, get some kind of resolution, at least in the immediate, on the nuclear stalemate, and it seems like we're moving towards something, then maybe he will be able to engage the Iranians in a broader dialogue. It will be slow, like, it started with the ping pong with Nixon. It's going to be that same kind of thing. I served on the President's Intelligence Board during Bush's first term, and I will be on the new Intelligence Board. We have very little intelligence about Iran. We haven't had any scholars, any American scholars in Iran for all these years, except, occasional somebody drops in, but nobody really studying, learning. We don't really know what's going on internally in Iran. So I think some of the early steps ought to be exchange of scholars, exchange of professors, opening up some of the universities. The Iranians living in Iran certainly want to come here to study, I can tell you that. So that, academia may be the way in which some of this will begin to unfold. It's not going to be overnight, it's going to take its time, but there will be the prospect of bringing Iran back into the global community.
Is there an Iranian emigre community? You might know this because of your clients, that could be helpful as opposed to...
They are as bitterly divided as the Iranians themselves. I mean, there are a small group of them who want to bring back the Shah in the form of the Shah's son, which is, I think, not likely. Let's put it that way. I won't say anything else. Not likely. There are others who feel engagement with Iran would be treasonous, and others who very much want to open up with Iran. I think Obama is going to go quite far in opening with Cuba, and that'll be, one again of how do you move forward rather than freezing yourself in a regime of sanctions that you never can get out of. Now, there's big political obstacles, particularly with Iran, and we do already have a sanctions network, so it's going to be tough. But I think he's going to devote a good bit of his energy to that question.
Good. All right. James?
Yeah, I'm James Pierce. I'm a second-year student here, and like Sean, have a pretty strong interest in the Middle East and North Africa. Last year, we started a group of students started a group focusing on legal issues in the Middle East and North Africa. So I have two questions about the region that are related. One is quite general. I mean, in your encouragement to us to mix it up, what do you see as, for students who have an interest in it with a law degree going to the Middle East, North Africa, what are some of the opportunities that you would advise, given your experience there, that we look to pursue? And then second is a bit more specific and actually related to something that as a group we're trying to do in the spring, which is, do you have a sense of what legal education in the region looks like? There are all sorts of different, I actually have a master's degree from the American University in Cairo, and so have some sense of it in Egypt, but just in the region generally, it seems like there's a lot of variation in the quality of legal education. I'm curious to hear you, encouraging us to go out and study abroad, what you feel the quality of such education is.
Well, legal education in the Middle East is very poor across the board. A lot of the so-called legal education is Islamic legal education, the traditional faculties that go back a millennia. I wouldn't advise you, unless you're interested in Islamic law and want to study that as a field, I wouldn't say that the Middle East is a great place, to really learn a lot about law, but I would certainly, if you're interested in practice, there are lots of law firms now operating, especially in the Gulf, which would be a good place to get going, out of Bahrain or Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Qatar. And you can branch out from there. They're loaded with money, and they're all trying to build better schools and better universities and so on. North Africa, Egypt, and so on, they've got terrible problems of social development, but it's an area that you ought to get into. But most of all, if you want to work in the field, you ought to study Arabic. I mean, I studied Arabic on and off. That's another one of my great dreams. I don't know if I'll ever do it. Is to take enough time and really master Arabic, and I would like to do that very, very much. But you can do that. You can go to AUB, American University Beirut is pretty good. Roberts College in American University now in Istanbul is very good. So there are places, in the Middle East where you can certainly learn. You can also learn here. I've been helping the Middle East Institute at Columbia University, which is the biggest faculty in language training in the country in not only Arabic, but the more exotic and esoteric languages. Now, you know, a lot of you, I don't know if many of you want to go into government work. I mean, CIA is desperate for people who have some knowledge of the Middle East. It's very thin. People who know the language, who know the customs. So if you have an interest in the Middle East, that's what I would suggest you do, is language and learning, forgetting about the law as such, and then you can begin to expand into your field. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Elmira Moreau. I'm also a second-year student, and thank you, ma'am, for coming today. It's really an honor. I wonder, I'd like to know your personal experience, particularly in working with the UN, if you ever found that you had a set of personal goals or values that you wanted to see achieved through the process that were ever in conflict with or differed from the United States who you're representing and then the system at large. Now that, and in the context of this, that now that we have such a large community of NGOs, if we choose to go that route, are we precluding a career within the institutional structure? Are we becoming more partisan, more advocate-oriented, and less institutionally oriented? Or is there a temperament that's right for that kind of work?
Yeah, if you want to be in government, even if it's international government, and be a member of the UN or one of the affiliated organs, obviously when you're a civil servant, you have to hew the line of your government or of the international organization that you're with. I mean, that's a necessity. If you have more of an advocacy point of view and you really want to fight to change various things, I recommend the NGO route. But there are many, many devoted people at the UN. I have spent years of working with them. They're faceless, they're nameless. They do all these incredible chores, whether it's humanitarian or in the conflict area around the world. You know, nobody ever applauds them, and people deride the UN because it often is blocked, or it's an organization of governments. It's all the governments of the world. But we recently did a seminar in Vienna in June on this new responsibility to protect, which is a new norm that is evolving in the UN, that governments have a responsibility to protect their people in the case of conflict, and if they don't, the world community can step in and try to change it. It came out of obviously the Balkan Wars and all these terrible things. So we had reports from 2 UN operations, one in the Eastern Congo and one in Chad, where there are 2 UN operations. The one in Chad is combined with the European Union. It's the most god-awful places, terrible terrain, horrible conditions, all kinds of conflict of every sort imaginable. And you had these people from all kinds of countries around the world who are doing this work at great risk, personal risk to themselves. Many of these peacekeeping units have lost people who have been killed, who are willing to go. And there was the Chad operation was, which the Austrian army runs the military side, was on the UN side, was run by a woman from El Salvador, a little woman. You know, you wouldn't think it when you realize what the nature of the conflict is. She was dedicated to helping to resolve conflict. She made this her life's work. She'd been in every miserable, UN operation. No one knows her name. No one knows about her. But I had a long talk with her in Vienna, and I said, why do you keep on doing this work? And she said, because somewhere, we've saved some children, we've saved some women from rape, we've saved some people from being killed. That, to me, is my life's gratification. So, there are people who are motivated across the board for all kinds of things, and you have to figure out for yourself what that motivation might be. Yep.
Hi, thank you again. My name is Chris Berg. I'm a 1L, and I've got an interest in East Asia and China specifically. And I want to know, through your experience and seeing NGOs sort of branch out and expand in power, how has it been in implementing NGOs within China regarding human rights and things like that? And is there a lot of movement, and how would you suggest people who are interested in pursuing international law in that sort of field, how do you overcome those obstacles where you have sort of these huge institutional barriers?
Well, there are in countries like China, Russia, Egypt, and so on, where NGOs are very carefully restricted when they get into anything that deals with politics. But there are other areas where NGOs are flourishing, and my husband and I established this center at Harvard, which is called the Harvard Center for Nonprofit Organizations, and it is the best in the field. If you go on the website, you'll see all the work that's being done in the field of philanthropy and nonprofits. And my husband had occasions, a long story, so I'll make it short, to meet the top Chinese people. When we were in China, we were guests of the president, President Hu, and they expressed a great interest to him that the Chinese, who have no law on any kind of civil society, because there doesn't exist in China, they want to establish now a not-for-profit sector. They realize that they can do things better, for example, in old age homes and in various and sundry food delivery and so on. They don't want to get near politics. They're not interested in people telling them how to run their politics. But if they can do things in the NGO sector that will better their society, they're extremely interested. So we have set up between Harvard and Beijing University, there is a big dialogue ensuing now, back and forth, and we're helping them to draft legislation. The only thing that exists is some British law in Hong Kong that went back to the British days, so you could establish something like a foundation. And then we had a conference at Harvard, which was fascinating, which we sponsored a few years ago with the Chinese diaspora and the Indian diaspora in America. People who had made a great deal of money here. And what did they want to do? They wanted to give something back to the place where they made the money in America, but they all wanted to give back to their hometown in China or their hometown in India. And they wanted to set up schools and hospitals and all that. The philanthropic motive is high. And the Chinese are keenly interested in, because they're huge, wealth outside China and inside China. I mean, many millionaires now, and they want to, so they're trying to harness that, and we're helping them do it. And it's legal. I mean, first and foremost, it's legal. You need a structure, you need a law, they don't have any of that. And other countries similarly are trying to harness the not-for-profit sector. So that's an interesting area, to get yourself into if you're interested in China. Let's see, I'll go over here.
Thank you again for being here. My name is Jamie DeWeese. I'm a 1L. And my question was actually going back to sort of the, I guess, your academic foundations, starting out with the integration of the European Union. And I was curious to know what, if anything, you thought that experience in Europe and the formation of the common market can tell us about the potential for similar integration in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico in particular.
We have NAFTA, and hopefully NAFTA will maybe one day expand into something more. I don't see it like the European Union. We're not going to have a union with, changing our structure here to incorporate Canada or Mexico into. Mexico may get there through immigration, but we're not gonna, it's not going to come any other way. No, Europe had a great motivation to do this after, 2 world wars, which were suicidal wars in which all of Europe, all the empires collapsed, everything. Killing on a massive scale. They were determined with great leadership in the post-war period to build a new Europe where basically conflict within Europe would not happen anymore. And it really won't. I mean, we've had conflict on the periphery like the Balkans. But within Europe itself, what is the point? In old wars, you fought over territory, Alsace-Lorraine, which changed hands 3 times. There's no point to that anymore. It's one Europe. They built a great structure of openness, travel, and professional licensing and education. And among the younger people, I've seen a great deal of polling in Europe. If you ask many young people, identify yourself. What are you? Who are you? Many will say, first and foremost, I'm a European. And then they might say, I'm a French European or I'm a German European, but I'm a European. And they see themselves in that context. And I truly believe that the greatness of those people like Adenauer and Schumann, who built this concept, their interest was to prevent Europe from ever having conflicts again. And that's why when Germany decided to give up the Deutsche Mark, we were at a meeting, we were with Kohl, he was then the chancellor, and someone asked him, why would you give up the Deutsche Mark, this great, strong currency? And his answer was very plain. He said it has nothing to do with economics. It has nothing to do with finance. It has to do with tying Germany into Europe so that Germany will never again pose a problem to the rest of the world. And he told the story of his father and his grandfather and all the wars in which they had fought. And he was determined that there would never again be a German question. And I believe that that is so. Germany is now really the biggest economy by far, the engine, but it is a different Germany. It has transformed itself. It is part and parcel of Europe. Now, someplace that might benefit would be Latin America, where there is some talk all the time about building a more unified Latin America. That's a little way off, but I think Europe has definitely led the way. And it's great, I don't know if you're studying that here, there must be courses in the European Union and
Yes.
the evolution of law and how legal systems are now being melded and what the European law looks like, the European Court of Human Rights, which has done so much. I was talking with Larry Helfer. There was a book a colleague of ours wrote about the European Court of Human Rights. And everybody signed up to it, even the British. And it was really interesting. The cases that have been brought to that court, I firmly believe the Irish question finally got resolved because the European Court handed down a series of rulings and very stiff fines against the British for practices that they had engaged in against Irish prisoners and various torture and so on that went on in the Irish conflict. And the British had to pay. And it led the Irish Catholics to realize that there were other ways of dealing with their grievances, that it didn't have to be through the gun. And when I had occasion to talk to Jerry Adams when he was in New York, he said to me, when the British were actually fined for having tortured us, they realized that there was a new Europe in the making. And that led them in a slow process to finally renounce the gun, which they gave up and are building a new Ireland. The European Court ruled against the British when they did not admit gays into the military. And so the British had to change their policy. Of course, guess what? Nothing happened and went on. I mean, it was easily done, but it would never have happened, in my opinion, in the near future within the context of England itself. There was too much opposition, as we see even in this country, came through the European Court. So these are transforming circumstances that we're seeing and we're living with, and it's very exciting. And if you can get yourself admitted to the bar someplace in Europe, you can practice anywhere in Europe, which is really interesting. I practiced in France. It was very tough. I mean, at that time there were no foreigners admitted for anything. Now they've changed their laws to make it easier for foreigners to argue in courts, and you can argue foreign law, everything has changed. The profession has changed, it's opened up, all because of this bigger spectrum, this bigger unity. And I think it's a tremendous experiment in world history, and I believe, as I said to Milton Friedman way back when, I think this is going to be a great success.
That you were involved in the UN student movement.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting and relevant because here at Duke we have an organization called the International Criminal Court Student Network, which is actually the first chapter of the ICCSN in the United States, affiliated with organizations abroad as well. I wanted to see if, from your perspective, there were lessons you feel like you learned in the course of your advocacy as part of the UN student movement that you think could be relevant.
Well, it's a very good way to learn all about the UN, and you also go to the international, conferences, you meet your counterparts. As I said, for me, what was very interesting, right from the student level up to my service in the UN, I met so many people who subsequently became the important people of their country. They became foreign ministers, justice ministers, finance ministers, leaders of industry. So, you network yourself right from the beginning into the international community. And the more you can do that, the better. I think you all should spend summers abroad. You should go and get some job with an NGO. You should do all of that. It's very, very worthwhile. If you ask me, should I get a job in a law firm in New York or go and work in an NGO abroad, I tell you, do the NGO. You can always work for a law firm.
Maybe.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Ashley Watkins, and I'm a 1L student. And I have an interest in China, but more specifically women's rights. And my question is kind of twofold. First, how do you see integrating women's rights into cultures where the social norms kind of deter that? And also, where do you see the biggest steps being made in women's rights? Because I personally view them as so fundamental and linked to so many different aspects of human rights that addressing that problem is really...
In some parts of it, in China, the women are in everything. I mean, that's one of the reasons that China has advanced as much as it has. Women are in the workforce altogether. I have great entrepreneurs women, you have great new development women. I mean, they're in everything in China. And from what I'm not an expert at all on China, but we've been there many times, it's a pretty matriarchal society. I mean, within the household, the woman is a powerful force. I don't think there's any problem in China on that front. There are, in the Middle East, there's very serious problems because of the status of women in Islam. And one of the reasons I believe that the Arab world particularly is so far behind in its change and its development, and it is an area of the world that has not really kept pace with its potential, is because women are largely uneducated and they are not used in the labor force and they are outside, you know, the social politic. And that is understood by Arab leaders, and the report of the Arab League, if you remember, a few years ago at the UN, criticizing that greatly, that you have to break through a lot of the Islamic stronghold in order to do that. Even in Saudi Arabia, where it's, you know, most controlled as to still fighting about women can drive cars, it's understood by the elites that the future of Saudi Arabia turns a great deal on harnessing women. And many of them do go abroad and do study and come back, and they find their way in a very difficult society for women, but they're making their way. That's probably the place where, you know, and in parts of Africa, also largely Islamic Africa, is where this is very backward. But every place else in the world, I don't think there's anybody who doubts that unleashing women is the key, and the key to that is education. Saw a couple of other hands.
There's one in the back there.
The back, yeah.
Hi, Ms. Hauser, thank you for coming. My name is Rocio Perez, and I am a 2L. I guess this would be more of a personal question for you. When you first started, you faced a lot of external barriers, but I imagine you also faced a lot of internal barriers in terms of fear, in terms of maybe self-doubt, maybe not.
Well, I'm going to tell you a story. First of all, I never had any self-doubt. So and I was always very determined, but I will really tell you an anecdote which you will appreciate, having been a judge. When I got out of Harvard Law School, I was in the honors program, and I went to the Justice Department, and, you know, maybe a few weeks out, I was given a case to argue in the First Circuit, which was very heady. And I was very young and very petite as I am, so I must have looked like I was 16. And there was the bench, and I was getting up to argue the government's position, and there was the lawyer on the other side. It was a big case, and he kept referring to me as little lady. He kept saying, you know, well, the little lady, accept this, and so. So it was my moment of truth. Don't ask me where I got over any doubt. It came up from within me, and I finally stopped, and I addressed the bench, and I said to the chief, I said, Your Honor, will you please tell my opponent that I'm not his little lady? He can call me Mrs. Hauser, he can call me counselor, he can call me my learned opponent, but not little lady. And the judge looked at me, and I looked at him, and he was an old judge. And he actually used to spit in his spittoon. That's how old he was, which I remember. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and boy, that was a moment of truth. And he turned to the lawyer, and he said, you will refer to her as counselor. And I never looked back from that day forward. Never looked back. And that's what you know, there's still obstacles for women. It's much easier now. But, you know, there were clients who wouldn't accept a woman lawyer and that kind of thing. You just You have to have enough confidence in yourself and what you're doing and why you're doing it, and sometimes you'll have some setbacks. And as I said, it was hard to get a job. Law firms weren't hiring women, but you just pursue. You have to believe in yourself. That's the most important thing, believe in yourself and whatever it is you want to do in life.
Okay, one more.
My name's Tom Fitzgerald. I'm a 1L. Thank you very much for coming. I was wondering if you could tell
Speak up a little.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your work with the Global Humanitarian Forum in Geneva,
Yeah.
what they do, and given those causes, how law students can prepare themselves to help with some of those causes.
Well, Global Humanitarian Forum is a new thing that Kofi Annan created. I was very close to Kofi. He's a very good friend of mine. I worked a lot with him when he was, he was the honorary chair of that organization I told you about. And I helped him a lot in thinking about what he would do next after he finished at the UN. We talked to the Swiss. He wanted to live in Geneva. And they helped him set up. And he had the idea for an international forum of NGOs to deal with humanitarian issues. So the first issue, it's only 2 years old. The first issue that he decided we should tackle was that the plight of actual victims of global warming. That there are many people living largely in the less developed world that have either been inundated by floods and pieces of Micronesia that have disappeared, great consequence of global warming. And so in Copenhagen in December, when the big conference on the environment opens, there will be an item, and Kofi will introduce it, on doing something for real live victims here and now of the global warming phenomenon, that this is not just an abstraction, but that there are many people who have been injured by that. And then he will take up other subjects as it goes on, but it's a forum of NGOs. And there I've gotten to meet a lot of people I didn't really know before, like the head of Oxfam, which is one of the largest charities and aids in areas of conflict, and how the NGOs are working with each other in the field. And, there's sometimes conflicts between them. I've done a lot of work. I'm interested in NGOs and the military. When you have a great crisis and our military gets into it, how do the military and NGOs intersect? How can they work better to help the people in the conflict? So that's some of the things that are on the agenda for that forum.
Well, about 30 minutes ago, you said that you were not a superwoman.
No.
But here you've been giving testimony for an hour against that fact. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.